Welcome back to another episode of
Just
a
a squirrel
looking
for a nut,
trying
to
get
get
out
out of this rut. Okay, we're still getting closer. We're approaching our year anniversary.
Right.
So, at some point, we need to get ourselves together. But that being said, that day will come when the universe is ready for it. And if there's not some sort of apocalypse in the interim.
Yeah, hopefully.
I'm going to start by telling you a story. Maybe someone in the audience can relate. Maybe you can relate. When I was a kid, there was this afternoon, I was a teenager actually, there was an afternoon TV movie on called A Thief in the Night. And what happened was that there was it was about a teenage girl. She had a perm and bell bottoms and she was bossy. And I think it was filmed in the 70s, and she lived with this family of good Christian people, but she could never she always had to have her own mind and her own opinion and a bad attitude. And so she went and took a nap one day, and she woke up and her whole family had disappeared. And there were empty cars and there were clothes lying on the floor that were empty and all this sort of stuff. And what had happened was that the rapture had occurred. All of the good Christians had disappeared, and she did not have the right religious beliefs, and so she was left behind. And there was a tribulation, and basically the son of Satan arose and ruled the world, and there were plagues, and you had to get a stamp with the number 666 on your forehead or on your wrist, and if you didn't, you went to jail. And I think at the end of the movie, the last scene was her in this world that was totally run amok. There was a scene of her putting her head on the guillotine because she refused to put this 666 on her, and you couldn't buy or sell anything, and the world was coming to an end and everyone was starving and there was riots and all of that sort of stuff anyway, and the minions of Satan were taking over. So I guess from her perspective, she didn't want to be executed, but she did stand up for her beliefs at the end and lost her head. And the last scene was a perspective shot of her with her neck in that hole in the guillotine with the slice coming down. And a few weeks after that happened, I went and took a nap. I woke up, and my mom and my dad, my sister, they were gone. I didn't know what happened. I just knew it was the end of the world. It was the apocalypse. And I had survived it. And I did not want to have survived it. I wanted to be gone in the rapture. I just knew that there would be locusts biting me, and the sea would turn red, and the skies would turn dark, and there would be weird diseases, and there would be a tyrannical evil person out to get people like me. And I didn't want to die on the guillotine. Oleg, I wanted to live. I wanted to live.
Do you fear the possibility of an apocalypse? First things first, do you think an apocalypse could even happen in today's day and age? And if so, what would that look like?
Interesting. So I used to think that it could happen. Another thing that I was scared of was nuclear war. Right? I grew up in the 80s, and Russia and the United States hated each other, and I was afraid that there'd be a nuclear. Now, the apocalypse, would I survive it? We'll talk about that in a minute. I at that time thought it was realistic, and I don't know if it really was or not, but it sure seemed that way. Is there an apocalypse now? I do think we are potentially headed for an apocalypse. It just might happen after you and I are dead. I don't want to be part of it. And I think that there could be some surprise apocalypse. Look, the pandemic, none of us saw that one coming. Well, some people did, but they were marginalized. There are those who, most of us didn't see it coming, and here we are. That didn't quite turn out as apocalyptic as it could have been. But what if it had been a truly incurable and faster spreading disease, like some new version of the bubonic plague? Yeah. I guess it could have happened. What about you? Do you think there's going to be an apocalypse?
I don't know. It's harder one for me to grasp my head around. So I was recently watching a movie, I don't know if you've seen it, called the Sum of All Fears with Morgan
I've always wanted to.
Morgan Freeman and Ben Affleck. And it's actually a pretty interesting film, but it's talking about is exactly as you described. And it's this, not to spoil the movie for anyone that's listening completely, but essentially the basic theme of it is that someone is trying to instigate a war between Russia and the United States.
Oh.
And the only way to do that was to essentially turn them against each other. So that's where this concept of nuclear weapons was used, on one country and then the other. And I found it interesting because I think I was actually doing some just brief research, however many months to maybe years ago, that went into I was looking at the number of nuclear weapons that each country has.
I'm sure that was depressing.
Yeah.
And pointless.
To say the least.
Yeah, to know our tax money is being spent on that.
But it was really eye-opening. I don't remember the exact numbers, but for example, US, Russia, and I want to say China, as well as a couple other countries, had just like an enormous amount of weapons. I like literally with one country's supply, you could probably destroy the world multiple times. So that this movie was pretty eye-opening for me because, well, for a couple of different reasons. A, I think it raised this question of what would happen if this form of apocalyptic behavior would take place. And there's so much of that also happens that, like, I don't know, we think you and I think we're in control of existence, but the reality of the matter is in most situations we aren't.
Yeah.
There are significantly higher level decisions that could be made, as well as are being made on a daily basis, that impact the way that we interact with the world, that we interact with ourselves. And I think if anything, for me, it was a fascinating concept as far as what would an apocalypse look like today. I don't think it would look, I don't know. It's hard to say. I don't think it would look anything from like The Walking Dead, for example. But I think if anything, digital warfare, cybercrime, stuff like that, like those are all relatively accessible weapons, or at least a series of behaviors that many people can access. Like that was one other thing that the movie pointed out that I didn't really think about, or I have thought about it before, but not in this perspective. And it's the fact that we have access to internet now, it changes everything. It truly does. Like you could start, theoretically, if you were dedicated enough, an apocalypse just using the internet and spreading ideas and ideologies.
Kenny, I want to say hello to you and thank you for joining us as always. It's good to see you. And if you have thoughts about the apocalypse, in particular, whether you would survive it or whether you think there's going to be one during our lifetime, are we living in the apocalypse right now? If so, why? Any of these sorts of things, we want to hear from you as always. And Kenny, I want to ask you in particular this. If there were zombies, if The Walking Dead did happen, would you snap them into shape? I have a feeling you just might. Now, Oleg, would you want to survive an apocalypse?
I think it probably is. That's a good question. I would say my natural instinct is yes.
Why?
But primarily because I don't want to die.
Do you think it would ever get so bad that you would rather just be dead, or would you always want to survive?
It's hard to say. I think just knowing what I know now and knowing certain historical events, I haven't personally seen or read or heard anything that would be that bad for me to not want to exist. It's also very difficult to say, for example, World War II, people that were in it, I mean, I bet it was horrific. But I'm reading about it 50, 60, 70 years down the road, and it's harder for me to really understand or maybe even assimilate myself into some of those situations. Like, there's a difference between, I think, reading about the experiences people went through in a concentration camp compared to living in it. So would those situations, if I had firsthand experience, be ones where I would not want to survive similar apocalyptic situations? Maybe. But I think if anything right now, it's a little bit harder. It's a little bit harder to understand So I think my general instinct would be yes, I would want to survive because I think there's, I don't know, life is for me, I find my life to be incredible, and so why would I want to end it? Would you?
I'll answer that in a moment. I've got to laugh at Kenny's most recent remark. Kenny, you never fail to deliver the goods. This is what sometimes you just got to give your fans what they want, and you gave me what I wanted. Thank you for that remark. And by the way, I think it is hilarious that when we're talking about zombies that eat people, you choose to include the word savor the flavor. I bet they do savor the flavor of those that they eat, my brother. Would I want to survive the apocalypse? Absolutely, yes. I thrive in apocalypses. That's what I'm made for. Hell yeah.
Do you feel like you have been in apocalypse type scenarios throughout your life leading up to today?
Whew. Interesting question. From a physical perspective, I would say the most apocalyptic experiences I've had were during COVID, during the darkest days here in New York, when it basically was looked like an abandoned city, although it really wasn't. And it was dark and it was gray and it was empty in the streets. That was somewhat apocalyptic, but it was more that I missed the people and joy, which I guess is at the core of what an apocalypse would bring. Then 9/11 felt in the moment apocalyptic, although it really wasn't because it was so concentrated in an area. But with buildings coming down that were huge and gigantic, multi-story billows of smoke coming at you, in that second, it felt like the world was ending. That was terrifying. Flight or fight instincts came into play, or some people just froze. I didn't freeze. But that was probably the closest I felt like from a physical perspective. I will be honest, because I believe in bearing all and throwing it out there so we can have a meaningful discussion. Emotionally, I feel like I should say, yes, I have gone through apocalypses. Emotional apocalypses. And those are psychologically barren experiences, or experiences without connectedness or without any sense of consolation in moments of sadness or of fear or of pain, of being in a world where no one cared, or where the emotions of those around you were the equivalent of barren, ugly cliffs. And so, yes, I have experienced that sort of apocalypse, and I can survive it. I survived it then, and that's why I feel absolutely I would want to survive the apocalypse, and it doesn't particularly scare me. Pain can be endured. Suffering and misery can be lived through. Absence of the things that we like, that we take for granted, the physical things, toilet paper or microphones or electricity. I'm fine figuring out how to hunt and eat. I'm down with that. Right. But what is truly apocalyptic to me is the absence of human companionship. That is the only situation, if I were the only person left in the world, or if it were someone I truly detested or was just emotionally unavailable, probably not even then, thinking about it, where I would feel like I might not want to survive and suicide might come into play.
Mm-hmm. Do you find, I already asked you this question many times before, like through, our numerous conversations, but going back to that 9/11 moment, I know you shared with me briefly as far as like what you had to go through. How close was it? Like, you actually saw the buildings and everything come down and debris?
Yeah. It was close enough that when the first tower went down, there was a thunderous sound in the air. It was unlike anything I've ever heard. And you literally saw it swaying. And I was close enough that if it wasn't clear that it was imploding. for all we knew from where anyone was standing, it was going to literally topple down. And if it had toppled down, I almost certainly, as well as everyone around me, would have died. But the instinct that all of us had, including 2 coworkers I was with that day, was to run. It was a profound flight instinct, unlike anything I have ever experienced before or since. And in terms of what the real meaning of that was, and you could literally see just these clouds coming at you, and they were so tall. The building that I worked in was about 25 stories high. I think the clouds were probably about twice as big as that. I mean, it was terrifying.
Wow.
It's hard to describe. And let's not forget that the World Trade Center was 100 plus stories tall.
Yeah.
And so it was, even if it had not, which it probably would have, if it had toppled down, it would have killed, the debris alone would have killed. But then there would have been the splattering, and there would have been all of this other stuff. You could see from where I was standing things, a constant stream of what looked like confetti coming out. And that's why I think I mentioned to you once before that I have a friend who had post-traumatic stress with regards to confetti for many years because she couldn't look at it. Now, there is an attorney that regularly appeared before the agency that I worked for at the time, who I had a friendly relationship with. And he told me that from his office, he looked out the window after the first plane hit, and he saw high up towards the top of one of that particular building, some people standing at the window, and he saw 2 of them grab each other's hands and jump.
Wow.
But the wind separated them. That to me would be a personal apocalypse. Something where you would have to make that sort of choice. And you know that the choice you're making, either one is hopeless. And so what you do is you hold on to that person. But to me, even more horrific than that would have been that moment when the wind ripped them apart. 2 things that I will say about that too. Number 1, an apocalypse to me would represent day after day, if it were truly apocalyptic, of those sorts of choices being made. So you would have this endless situation where horrific choices were just the order of the day. And then number 2, where the psychological equivalent of the wind ripping and you descending alone into an abyss would be again something that you deal with all the time. Kenny says we're living in apocalyptic times. I would say, actually, Kenny, from an emotional perspective and from the perspective of our cohesiveness as a people, I don't know that I disagree with you about that. And I actually, you know, I obviously in words, I can't detect the tone with which you wrote that. But even if you wrote it in sort of a sassy, jokey tone, I imagine reading that you yourself probably said that with a certain degree of seriousness, if not complete seriousness. Melody, it is good to see you. I know I owe you some PMs on LinkedIn, so don't think I've forgotten you. I read every single thing that you write. I just am behind this week due to some things, but it is good to see you. And someone as empathetic as you, I could only imagine really these situations would be tough, which goes as to how would empathy look?
Yeah.
And is that an emotion that could be so crippling you'd have to let it go, or would it be the emotion that keeps you alive?
Well, I think that's a harder one to answer because I at least based on my understanding of what an apocalypse would look like, based on a lot of the different movies and books that I've read, I think empathy for other people, at least as far as the themes that are portrayed through those forms that I watched, it's I don't know. I don't know to what degree it's existent and to what degree it truly does become about the survival of just the individual beings. I'm sure that there are, I don't know how that works. I don't know if there becomes a point where one's existence is truly in so much jeopardy that empathy for other people just no longer becomes a thing. It becomes a lot more about survival. I think for me, and I can only say this with knowing what I know now and having not experienced apocalypse type settings, I would probably still want to help other people. I would probably still, and I think it's just natural character of who I am. Deep inside is just wanting to help others. So I think about situations like this. For example, it's not necessarily an apocalypse, but I guess you could say it's similar as far as what it could present is flying on airplanes. Flying on airplanes, for me, it took me a while to get used to the concept because of the uncertainty of it. And then there was almost like a series of layers that I had to go through personally to understand and get comfortable with being on a plane. First was understanding that the turbulence, what feels like on the inside, you're dropping
it's terrifying.
50,000 feet, but the reality is you're only dropping 5 feet. You're only dropping a foot sometimes.
Yeah.
And then I had to work through, okay, what happens when you get into jet streams and you do go 400, 500 miles per hour, which I can't even imagine. Yeah. How fast is that? So, like I struggled beating a car that goes over 100. Now I'm going in a plane that goes 5 times the amount of that. So that's where I think I've often questioned, and this isn't necessarily when I'm even sitting in the emergency rows, but more so just any seat. And that's that if anything were to happen, there's that thing inside of me that just keeps telling me, it's like, your first instinct would be to help other people. So I think, I don't know, I think there's something about it. What would empathy look? I think empathy would look like what one has conditioned themselves to be. I think if you are, in my opinion, I think if you are an empathetic person to begin with, I don't think much of it would change, but I could be wrong. I think in an apocalypse, you don't know what's going to be at stake. It may not always be necessarily your safety. What if it's the safety of your case? What if it's David? What if it's your family? What if it's my family? How does empathy change then? Do we stay empathetic to others, or do we solely become about the safety of our own existence as well as those closest to us?
Yeah. I can answer that one pretty quickly. But before I do that, yes, Melody, turbulence is a little scary, particularly if it drags on. And Josh Corporal in the house. Homie, man, what's up? Good to see you. Yes. And those Disney rides are kind of scary. Even if your Disney won't let anything happen to you now, would they? Because Disney just loves people too much. So,
it's part of the thrill.
It is part of the thrill. It better at least simulate real terror.
Yeah, that's really what the experience is one sign ups for.
By the way, about this time, or right before the pandemic, I should say, last year in 2020, I was in Las Vegas, and there's an indoor amusement park there called Circus, and there was this ship. Josh, it made me think of you. There's this ride you get on where they simulate you being on a ship. And it was the only amusement park ride I've ever been on in my life where I really thought I was going to throw up. I really did. When it was over, I turned to my husband and I said, I'm really not feeling that well right now. Let me ask you, I'll tell you the answer, Oleg, and then you to the question, I want to hear what you have to say. Yeah, you threatened David, you're dead.
Yeah.
No remorse. Sorry. Tough to be you. Don't do it.
Yeah.
And if you threaten me, maybe under certain circumstances, I probably would instinctively sacrifice my own life to save David's. I've thought about this, and that is sort of, and I do have just a strong protector instinct, and it's very, very difficult for me to get past. Empathy for me does not come if there is a threat to someone I'm protecting.
Yeah.
I once had a past life reading, and the person told me that I was someone that protected holy relics in another life and that I failed. And so part of my makeup today is that I protect people to sort of make up for that crime, that moral crime that I felt I committed. I have no idea if that's true or not, but I will say the person who gave me that reading knew my character.
Now, did you consciously register that? Was that a conscious decision you made after you received the reading?
No, I received the reading not that long ago, and I have been in situations, David's seen it, where someone's threatened him, or I felt on the streets of New York City is where that happens. Yeah, you're done for.
Yeah.
And if I were walking down the street with you, or with Melody, or with Kenny, or someone like that, and someone were to threaten you, any of them physically, especially if it's a female, yeah, get out of my way. Don't think I'll feel bad about it. And if you don't want to be protected in the case of an attack, well, then hang out with somebody else. I ain't your man. Melody just simply says, interesting.
Yeah.
And Josh said, he knows that thing. I think that's the getting sick thing.
Do you go to amusement parks?
I love amusement parks. They're the best.
Yeah. Have you been to Cedar Point?
Love them. Do you?
Have you been to Cedar Point?
I don't even know what that is. Where is that?
In Sandusky. It's like the best amusement park in the world.
No, but I want to go. Where is Sandusky? I've never even heard of Sandusky.
Sandusky, Ohio. It's like.
I have heard. I want to go. You'd have to get me to Ohio.
Yeah, it's like a little island there, but I think it's the best amusement park in the world. At least the one that I've been to. The rides are just exponentially higher. There are a lot more of them.
I love it.
Yeah. So that is talk about a thrill, is being able to be on one of those rides and everything gets put into question. Your life, your existence.
Yeah. Well, let's face it, as much of an innocent thrill as we think that these amusement park rides are,
sometimes things go wrong.
Sometimes they go wrong and they are horrific and horrible.
Yeah.
And Melody said what she was talking about being interesting was a past life reading. Thank you for that. And then she also says that she's been known to jump into action. Good. If there's a zombie apocalypse or anything like that, Melody, I will hand you a very big knife sort of thing, a katana, and you will be expected to hold your own. I'm just saying. Oleg, would you, like if poor innocent little Scott Mason were walking next to you and someone threatened me, would you go into action, or would you have empathy and try to have a courageous conversation, a very courageous conversation with the nut that was trying to murder me? Answer it carefully, my friend.
That's a good question. So I think it depends on the situation. I think I think it depends on the situation itself. I think there are certain situations that could be resolved through just like verbal resolution, but outside of that, maybe, and if it is truly an apocalypse where everyone's going out after you and there's not necessarily a need for the other one to survive, then yeah, probably I'd probably do a similar thing that you do. But I think in most cases I don't know, I think I would try and talk, going back to that courageous conversation, I would probably try and have a courageous conversation, because I believe in the possibility that it's possible to win people over. And I don't think it's necessarily means about proving them that they're wrong and proving yourself that you're right. But it's more so, I think, about just creating an opportunity for people to see both sides and know that one's not necessarily that much better than the other. Like I'll give you an example. I heard this pretty profound statement. I was talking to a person who he lives outside. He's homeless by definition, and he lives near one of the parks where I play basketball at a couple times a week. And I was having a conversation with him, and he was talking to me about just the general activity that he witnesses from day to day, and somehow the conversation got on to weapons and using weapons to protect or whatever the reasons are. And he said this really profound statement. He said, he doesn't believe in using weapons against other people, because he said that if in using a weapon against someone else, what ends up happening is that that person's problems are solved, but yours just started. And that's where I found that there's such a profound statement in that moment, because I do think that, I don't know, it all depends on the situation, but I do believe that most situations could be solved through conversation alone.
So
at least most of the ones that I've encountered, you know.
Melody is agreeing with you and making a point that many of these conflict situations can be and should be escalated as the first line of defense. And even I have a hard time disagreeing with that, although if you're coming at me fast enough. De-escalation is something I constantly working on. Again, this protector instinct just comes out so strong. It's not even something I have within my conscious control. And so it's really a challenge for me to stop moving in that direction and then pull back and rationalize. But that's part of what personal growth is, as you look at the most difficult situations in your life. And that's when you really test yourself. Kenny says, Oleg doesn't have a violent bone in his body. He says, bless your heart. I will say, Oleg, you have a good heart. That's a beautiful thing. And I think that in the apocalypse, believe it or not, contrary to popular movies and everything, good-hearted people are well equipped to survive. And so I think that you would do well. And perhaps the courageous conversation tendency that you have would help build bridges and enable people to come together and feel connected, so that they as a group could counter our more base instincts. Kenny also says, I'll go off on someone crazy if you need to. Kenny, you're so deliciously predictable. I love it. Like I said, you know how to give your fans what they need. Here is a toughie.
Yeah.
But I'll introduce it with a lighthearted story. For those of you with tender ears, you're going to hear something that might shake you up a little bit, but I would love to hear thoughts about this. There was a lady I know, and by the way, Melody agrees that you're a natural peacemaker. I do too. I think that's something very profoundly wonderful about you. It places you at a higher plane. Looking down on ruffians. So anyway, this woman I know, she is a very progressive politically woman, and she's very daring. She's in her late 70s. And she moved into a new area of the city that she lived in. And there were a bunch of other very conservative women who were her age group, and they liked to go have tea and lunch. And because my friend was a new woman in town, they invited her to be one of the ladies that had lunch. And my friend didn't like their boring conservatism. She wanted something, even though she was in her late 70s, she wanted something that was a little bit more exciting. So she up and decided to talk about the apocalypse during tea and crumpets. And while they were sipping away and delicately eating whatever little cookies, she asked them each if in the apocalypse they would be willing to eat the bodies of dead people in order to survive.
That's funny.
And my little old lady friend was never invited back to hang out with the ladies who lunch again. None of them ever spoke to her. But how far would you go in order to survive? If it, like, would you do something like, would you be willing to cross some of those innate lines? Like
cannibalism.
Cannibalism. Would you eat me?
Personally,
in order, if it was you or me, would you eat me? Would you put me in a skillet and fry me?
I couldn't do it. I don't know how people. I don't know. I don't know, and I certainly am not going to judge anyone that has to if the measures do get that desperate. But just knowing who I am, I don't think I'll be able to do it. Just the
conscious I will hang out with you during the apocalypse.
But you got to think about it. At least from my perspective, it's like there's that conscious. First, there's that conscious thought of here is a living being in front of you that you're going to eat. Second is the actual eating of that being. Third is the process, the swallowing, and it's just like there's so many steps part of that journey that I truly don't wish I have to embark on.
I love how you view cannibalism as a journey. I suppose it is. It's a mindset shift. Yeah, let's use every self-help bromide there is under the circumstance. If you manifested it, will happen.
But that is an interesting conversation to have over.
Kenny tells us to stop. Melody saying, I couldn't eat it either. But Melody, if you really believed it, do you think the law of attraction would bring other cannibals in your direction? I can't believe I'm saying all this because I actually believe all of these self-help bromides.
I'll share with you. I'll share.
Oh, Melody says you've given some thought to this, Oleg. Maybe I should be a little bit more scared than I am.
Yeah, maybe you should find a different crowd. No, but so there was this movie. I don't know if it was a movie or a documentary, one of the two, and you might have heard about this concept where the man was trapped. I think he was hiking, and he was trapped between a rock. He fell down, or he was hiking to a cave. You remember that? And then
yes,
he had to cut off or chew off his arm, something,
or his leg, or something
really intense like that. So that was my, I can't say the first encounter, but that was a very eye-opening experience, because it's like, well, what would you do? What would you do if I can? And the other part, I think, going back to your question, is not necessarily the eating of other people, but would you ever eat yourself? I mean, what if you were the absolute last living being with no other source of food?
Kenny talks about the texture and the aroma. I assume in that state, my texture and aroma would be less than appetizing, but I don't know. I probably would be so deranged I might do it. J.R.R. Tolkien, the great author, tells a story of an evil spirit that inhabited the body of a giant spider. And this spider was consumed with greed and lust. And it ate and it ate and it ate. And finally, it ended up devouring itself because there was nothing else for it to eat.
Yeah.
And maybe hunger would drive me into a situation where I would do that. Or maybe if I felt hope, as the man who was caught between the cliffs or whatever did, there was hope for him to survive, somehow make it out of this, so he was willing to do this. If I were the last person alive and there was no hope, that goes, I guess, as to whether something really is an apocalypse or not. The extent to which there is hope.
Yeah.
Oleg, where you feel there is no hope, and what do you think you would do if you felt there was really no hope?
It would be hard to exist. It'd be very difficult to survive. I think without hope, hope is a component towards meaning and purpose. And I think without hope, for me at least, it'd be very difficult to find meaning or purpose in existence. And if there was no hope for the future, if there was no hope for the next moment, then what's the point? And then I guess you could argue then the point is just be and not focus on the future. But even then, I think that is still somewhat tied into hope. Hoping that the present moment can exist. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think hope is a pretty critical component of existence, at least based on my understanding of it. And if there was no hope, it'd be very difficult to find reasons to exist. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have different perspective on that? What role do you think hope plays in existence?
I think that hope can play a role in existence. I recently read an article in the fantastic Aeon magazine. It's an online philosophy magazine that I subscribe to. And it talked about the deathbed regrets studies. Basically, we all have read quotes by people who may have worked in hospices or nurses that are in terminal wards. Mm-hmm. And they consistently say, as people are laying on their deathbeds, the one thing that they never regret is being with their family or loved ones. They don't sit around, though, and say, oh, I wish I'd spent more time at the office. Oh, I wish I'd spent more time working. Oh, I wish I had spent more of my life doing paperwork. And this article was pointing out that people naturally assume that as people are towards the very end of their lives, they somehow are able to offer wisdom about the way we live life. Mm-hmm. And this article, I think, perhaps accurately pointed out that when you are at the end of life and you know that there's no future, you divest yourself of hope. And that divestment of hope disengages you from the world. So doing paperwork, working all the time, being at the office, focusing on money and buying cars and status and those sorts of things, those are symptoms of being invested in the world. They are symptoms of hope, because you aren't invested in the world if you believe that there's nothing worth, there's no future outside of that exact moment worth engaging in. And so really it approached these deathbed statements of what people's values are and what their regrets were and all of that sort of stuff with an extreme degree of skepticism. But the reason why I share all of that isn't just for interesting informational purposes, but to point out that those are people who really don't have hope. But they haven't, and they have divested themselves, if this article is to be believed, in the world.
Yeah.
But they still don't kill themselves. They still exist in it. So for some limited period of time, maybe it's just to placate the ones that they love, or to be with those people that they love, or because they just, even without hope, they see no reason to take the affirmative step of ending their lives. They still live without it. Now, how long one could meaningfully exist in that state is another matter altogether.
That's a good question, actually, because I was thinking about it myself as far as the different regrets that I have personally seen people experience on their last days. Some of them were very similar to that, but in regarding to your first point, I can't say that I heard a single one where the individual had said that they wish they had worked more or did more paperwork. And I think maybe part of that is just because of the conditioned beliefs that I think many of us have been taught or passed down to. It's that it almost seems like life can't be experienced in a work type setting. Life happens outside of work, which I think maybe sometimes unnecessarily creates barriers, creates unnecessary walls when one goes into work-like environment, because then there's that thought that, okay, this is work. I can't actually experience life here when, I don't know, like right now, like this is part of our quote unquote work.
Yeah, this is our job.
I'm fully alive.
Yes.
So I think if anything, it's just a matter of belief. And the other thing that I'll say is just that regrets. I don't know if, personally speaking, I don't know if I have any regret, so to speak. Are there things in my life that I wish I could have done differently? I think I've worked through that process. I think there are things that I could improve upon, knowing what I know now. There were times throughout my life where I did have certain regrets, about how I dealt with certain situations in the past and how I handled certain conflicts, whether it was personal relationships or friendships or whatever it was. But it will be interesting to observe, like, hopefully once I do get to experience that point, what would those last moments look like? What does hope look like at that point? Does it exist or does it not?
Well, I just had a glimmer of hope in my life.
Yeah.
The awesome podcaster Gabe Leal is in the house. I'd been hoping this would happen for some time. Gabe, you gave me a reason to live again. Thank you so much. It's good to see you here. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah.
I've got to say, I fear, maybe I'm just insane, that on my deathbed, I will have not achieved enough professionally, that I will sit and say, I could have done so much professionally. I could have made millions, and I didn't. I could have built the next Amazon, and I didn't. I could have invented a new form of suspenders.
Yeah.
Screwed that one up. And so sometimes I wonder if if these things tell the whole story, and if maybe there's some biases that are in these things. And Kenny is saying hi to Gabe, so I like it when people say hi to each other because y'all are good folks. But sometimes I on my deathbed say I wish I'd spent more time doing paperwork. Oleg, if that happens, it's just time to shoot me. Euthanasia will be justified. But paperwork, or as opposed to work and professional, maybe because for me, at least as someone who is living now and invested in this world in a way that, again, those that are on their deathbed may or may not be. Fortunately, I've never experienced that so far either.
Yeah.
I tie so much of what brings me joy and gives me meaning and gives me passion, gives me the force to live to what I do for work. Now, I might not have felt that years ago when I was in jobs that I felt were either meaningless or ridiculous or oppressive or all those other things. But where I'm at now, so much of my identity is tied to that drive to succeed and go through, have my providential river turn into the tidal wave of impact in this world. And so that is something I question about. Whether on my deathbed I'll say, Scott, man, there was potential there that involved your work that you didn't do. And then, boom.
How would that change how would the following change the meaning of your life? What if you knew that you wouldn't get to experience the last moments?
Well, I guess that happens. Like if you're walking down the street and someone knocks you over the head with a baseball bat and you're done.
Or you get hit by a bus.
Get hit by a bus like in Final Destination.
Lightning strikes right now. Or whatever happens.
Well, that's an interesting point.
How would that change your meaning?
Nothing. Wouldn't. I'd be gone. I wouldn't have the time to reflect.
Yeah. No, but
so
I'm
maybe
saying
that's the
in the future. Let's say you get a reading, right?
Oh, and the psychic says you're going to die.
And the psychic says you're going to die, but you won't get the final moments to reflect upon, to experience all these things, and it's just going to happen. How would that change how you perceive life today?
That's a great question. As Gabe says, I would have been angry. I would strive very hard to invent time travel and suspenders. I would have been very angry and disappointed that Gabe did not wear suspenders before, and isn't wearing suspenders at this very moment, perhaps. I would lean into. I answer that in two potential ways. Part of me, I have to be honest, Oleg.
Yeah,
and that's really putting a point on the head of the pin. I might drop everything and spend as much time with David as I could, because he's so precious. He is the most precious thing in my world, and a few other people that I genuinely care about. David more than anything, and like I said, these few relationships that are the most meaningful to me. Part of me, that's what my gut instinct says I would do. Part of me says I might try and drive myself to have some sort of highly maximal impact in whatever little time I have left, particularly if it's unknown or short, and then particularly if I were to reframe it the way Melody just did in one of her remarks, which is rather than looking at the external impact, think about how many people I inspired. It may drive me to do just a squirrel looking for a nut every day for 2 weeks, if 2 weeks was what I had. And then try and impact as many lives as possible that way and leave a legacy that I could be proud of.
Do you know who you inspire on a daily basis? Is that important to you?
Asking me questions I can't answer. Do I know? You never know who you inspire.
But do you know a handful of people that you do?
There are people that have told me that I inspire them, and so I believe that I do inspire them.
Yeah.
And yeah, you don't. The reason why I answer that somewhat cagely is you don't really know. I'm not saying anyone's a lie, or lying or anything, but you don't truly know other people's hearts or why people say things or whatever. So I might think I know some of those people are inspired by me, but really they're just saying it because they want to be on my podcast. Gabe, has that ever happened to you? I suspect it's happened to me. And so I ever truly know.
Yeah.
Now, would that matter to me? Yeah, I have to say it would matter to me if I inspired someone. Would it matter to me more than if I were to say, shit, David's about to go into poverty and I didn't work enough to get him money so that he could live comfortably in my absence? Maybe then I would regret having not spent more time at the office or doing more paperwork. Yeah.
I always get curious about that question because I think, at least in my opinion, what I've learned through many of these podcast conversations, and I mean, it's been hundreds and hundreds of hours by now, it's that, at least my understanding of it, many people that I have had conversations with don't truly feel appreciated in life.
Yeah.
And I think part of it comes from not knowing what difference or what impact you have in the lives of others.
Yeah.
And I think within that, it's a two-way street. Not choosing to, I don't know how it works. Do you ask the question like, hey, do you feel inspired by what I shared or how I show up? So I think it's partially from one end, and I think it's partially from the other. I think it's partially from the other end, and that is when the person feels like someone else has made a difference in their lives, they don't choose to express that. And I'm not saying that as a way to accuse anyone of doing actions that they should have done differently. I think it's just, what I'm saying is that that's what I've observed, is that I think I've experienced this myself. I've gone through life through many, many years and didn't choose to express my appreciation to certain people who have made an impact. And then I changed a course, and there's still situations where someone does help me throughout a day. It could be one-time encounters, and I may never see that person again. And so I'm just trying to become more conscious in that moment to truly express that, because I think there is something to be said about knowing the fact that you have made a difference in someone else's life, because I do think that does contribute to the concept of hope. And I think if anything, it also can contribute towards additional reasons to live and to exist. I think inspiration is truly powerful. And knowing that you made a difference, knowing that you make an impact, for some people, for me it is, for others it may not be, and that's perfectly fine. But yeah.
Imagine that we have the ability to see ourselves for a brief time after death. Sure. Some would argue that that's not an imaginary thing at all.
Right.
But let's just say, for the purpose of this next question, that it is something that we are capable of doing indisputably. Mm-hmm. I read, there's a really famous author by the name of Dean R. Koontz. He's sort of a horror writer. And I read an interview with him. His father was a real jerk. I wondered, reading the article about his relationship with his dad, who was just such a monster, apparently, that it wasn't any surprise Dean R. Koontz writes horror stories. He's probably just writing fantastical versions of the psychological experiences that he had as a child living with this man. And apparently his father wasn't just a nightmare to him and his mother. His father was a nightmare to everybody. He was universally despised in his community. And when his father had a funeral, like the church set up the casket and they laid out all the seats for people to come, and no one showed up. No one gave about him. And so I wonder in those situations whether if you were seeing your life situation or the funeral reactions to your passing away, and you had that sort of reaction, whether you would care. And the reason why that's coming to mind is Gabe said a little earlier that what we create here is our legacy. And I actually do agree with that. Thank you for raising that point. Yeah. George W. Bush, during a debate for the presidency, famously said he didn't care about his legacy. And he was asked, what do you think your legacy will be? And it was in the context of the Iraq war. And he's like, I don't think about it. I don't care. And so there are definitely approaches to how we view our lives or how we want our lives to be remembered. I'm with Gabe. I would like it to be remembered at least by somebody for a couple of days and hopefully in a positive way. And if I were to somehow survive my death and walk into a funeral as a ghost and see no one there, or even worse, people celebrating like what happened when the Wicked Witch melted, I'd be bummed. I'd be bummed. And so would you care?
Would I care?
How would you feel if that happened?
The question is, would I care if no one showed up to my funeral?
Yes.
I think it would be sad. I think it would be sad because I feel like I have made a positive difference in many of people's lives. But at the same time, I guess the question is, why is that the ultimate piece to the puzzle? Why is it? Why do I aspire for that? Why do I aspire to have a packed home on the day that I pass? And what if life is celebrated through other forms? So long story longer, I would care, absolutely. But at the same time, I don't think it would be I don't think I would define my life by that moment alone, because of the fact that, I mean, some people maybe couldn't make it. Maybe some of the people that I've impacted who live literally halfway across the world just had their own circumstances. Maybe they're on their deathbed. So I think there's so many situations that impact that. That's why it's a little bit harder to answer. Would I care? And then to what degree would you care based on the number that showed up? What is a sufficient number for you to be like, my life was well lived? Is it 50 people? Is it 100? Or is it only the ones that were truly next to you? And is it only the ones that were truly next to you at what point of your life? When you were struggling in an X, Y, and Z way? Is it the people that were with you the last 5 years? Is it the people that were with you the last 24 hours? How would you justify that? How would you justify that experience as something that made your life worthy?
On a slightly different topic.
Yeah.
But not totally unrelated.
Yeah.
Oh, like your hair looks different this week. It looks like you got more of a swoop. The hair in the front looks like it's a little bit longer. That's not just me, is it? Right? You got sort of a different cool look going on there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the hair is growing. It's preparing. It's having an apocalypse of its own.
I was going to say, how much would you care about how you looked after the apocalypse? Would you think you'd be able to let some of that vanity go? Or would you hold on to some of those things?
After an apocalypse, I would probably stop getting haircuts. Because why? I've lived through the worst thing that the world could offer me already. So what's the point of keeping an appearance?
I'd struggle.
And I would want to preserve that. I would probably want to wear that as a badge of honor. I'll probably wear the same clothes if I'm being honest. Hopefully I don't outgrow them.
Would you care what clothes they are? Would you want the ones that fit well and make you look good?
To be honest with you, that's a harder question because it would boil down to what would really be important at that point, especially if you've survived it. And because you got to think about it this way, or at least this is how I think about it. Okay, I got to rephrase that because we're not going into an apocalypse. I don't want to manifest anything that could possibly could actually happen. But let's say hypothetically, right? If I knew that an apocalypse would happen, I think the answers to my question of what's important in my life now would be drastically different than surviving an apocalypse. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I say that is because if apocalypse truly is the worst or the most horrific thing that could take place on the face of the earth, having survived that, I think there are many of these things that I don't think would be as important. For example, wearing business attire to a business meeting compared to some other dress code to another meeting. Like, would that really be important at the end of the day, having gone through that experience? I think, in my opinion, many of these things right now, the reason why I choose to give them importance is because I haven't experienced that setting. Would food become more important than clothes? Would shelter become more important than some of these other things?
Than your hair.
Exactly. You know? Would knowing the fact that that's really what it would come down to is the basic needs, would I become more appreciative of them? Would I stop throwing food away? Would food waste completely eliminate itself? Would recycling even be a concept?
Yeah, if we're all ashes.
And if we survived it, I look at those things and it just makes me question, what level of appreciation would life have at that point, if any? With some of these things that I think I take for granted, I mean, I don't think about electricity on a daily basis, but think about the important role it has in our lives. It gives us a chance to do this. And on top of that, it not only gives us a chance for you and I to connect, it gives us a chance to connect with Melody, Kenny, Gabe, and everyone that's a part of it in different parts of the world.
Yeah.
If electricity wasn't a thing, this wouldn't be possible. If we didn't have water, if we didn't have food. So I think, if anything, the apocalypse, and let's say hypothetically, if I were to survive it, I think it would create beautiful opportunities to look at life through a completely different lens and appreciate some of these things that I take for granted on a daily basis today.
So are you saying that an apocalypse might be a good thing?
I don't think it necessarily that. I think it's I think there could be a benefit. And I'm not saying that like we need to have an apocalypse in order to see that, but I am saying that it's possible to view life through a different lens after an event like that.
What would be the scariest apocalypse that you could imagine?
Probably a form of nuclear, I think, because I think for example, if it involves situations like Walking Dead, that's something that I could still somewhat control, you know, because that's just the battle against other people. So you could still use different tactics and whatever else, weapons. But if it's a nuclear scenario, then you really can't do much, because once it drops, what are you going to do? You can't stop many elements of it. You can't stop the initial explosion. You can't stop the after effects that it has for miles upon miles. I mean, you literally have to, I don't know, how would you breathe? How would you control your breathing in a way that you don't inhale many
radiation sickness?
Radiation sickness, which passes down through your skin.
Yeah.
Does it pass down through the walls? Would it pass down through the walls of a building?
Sure, some of it would, I'm sure, depending on the wall. assuming the wall itself didn't burn. I mean, there's the fireball associated with these weapons.
Yeah. And how long does that stay? Because I've been curious about that in regard to like Chernobyl, because that's still like a big problem there.
Yeah, but then wildlife has totally come back and it's thriving too. And I have read that the half-life, if you are able to shelter in place successfully during a nuclear attack and you're not incinerated, and you just don't go outside for a period of time that isn't an incomprehensible part of time, you'll actually probably be okay, because the most dangerous things have a very rapid deterioration rate. And of course, there will be more radiation than is healthy for you to be around, but you could at least navigate that radiation. Look, there are people that were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki when those bombs went off.
Yeah.
And they lived to be in their 90s. They just survived the first blast.
Yeah. How long does it last? Like you said, time, like what does that time look like?
I don't remember. I read it. It was not some extreme amount of time.
Not years?
No,
days?
Not the worst sort of stuff. I want to say days, maybe a couple of weeks.
Okay.
It really wasn't unsurvivable. It really wasn't. If you had water, basically, you could survive it. One interesting thing to know, I read about in Hiroshima, just a survival tip.
Yeah.
If you're ever in a nuclear attack,
apocalypse,
that one of the things that happened in Hiroshima, there was a river, and these hordes of people were walking to this river because the heat from the nuclear bomb dehydrated them severely. It literally just sucked moisture out of the body. So people were instinctively going to the river to get something to drink. But if the minute they had any water in their mouths, they just died. And so people were survivors, but they were going to this river and dying from drinking the water. And one of the survivors said he somehow had read this, or he was conscious enough to be observing this happen to just say, okay, I'll endure this thirst. I don't need this river. And he turned away. But even before and after, and people would see it happen, and they were still walking to the river. And that goes as to something else that these apocalyptic scenarios can raise, which is, to what extent is our herd mentality or the desire that we have for connection facilitating a herd mentality? And that's something that we have to live with every day, and that could also, that creates some of the apocalyptic elements, at least in my opinion, of our current culture that Kenny was talking about much earlier in the conversation. Groupthink, everyone just sort of following the same line of thinking. And then before you know it, I read that in the Civil War, or in the run-up to the Civil War, which had to have been pretty apocalyptic, at least on a local level, that none of the politicians or activists involved actually wanted, or the militaries wanted to have a civil war. None of them. They basically had created this rhetoric that was inflammatory, and that was, we're calling each other traitors and all of this sort of stuff. This was particularly apparently in the South. And they were calling for secession, and that actually sort of whipped up the populace, but no one really thought that it would happen. This is all just, these are words that'll help get us elected, or that will help get people behind us, or will help us get whatever they needed to have. But then they found that the public, because of this sort of group behavior whipped up by this secessionist, very anti-North mentality, people expected them to act. And so up until the very time that the war was declared, no one thought that this would actually happen. And that's the sort of thing that I wonder if it, could cause an apocalypse too. Everyone just assuming that whatever the next step is a game, and that surely the ultimate end outcome won't happen. But because no one ever backs down, and a public expectation is created by the rhetoric that's out there, there's no choice but to have the apocalypse. Or there is a choice, but people's only choice was to admit that they'd been BSing the public all along, and they're afraid of being excoriated by the public, so they just go ahead with the quote-unquote nuclear options.
Yeah. That's interesting. I didn't think about it that way. But I could see how groupthink could probably provoke certain behaviors that may or may not serve. That's where I think it's important to have some forms of leadership to be able to move a culture forward. And I think good leadership probably plays a pretty critical role, especially in today's day and age, considering the advancement, just how advanced the society really is compared to how it used to be. Like we were talking earlier, the internet completely changed the way that the world works now. And that's where I think leadership is probably even more important, because truly most, if not everyone, does have an access to influence someone else through internet alone. And you don't need a license. You don't need anything for that. You need to have some financial means to buy some form to communicate through, smartphone or computer or whatever it might be. But yeah, I think it's a very different world than what it used to be. If anything, there are probably a lot more things to consider in order to prevent an apocalypse.
If there were an apocalypse and you were just surviving on hope,
yeah,
do you think you'd have time to miss your friends? To wonder whatever happened to Melody or Kenneth or Gabe or me?
Probably not, right? Because I think my survival would be so dependent on getting from 1 minute to another. I think if anything, where that feeling would come into play is when I understand that this is the last moment, so to speak. This is the last breath. Because as you had said earlier, there is no hope at that point. Yeah. There is no concept of a future. All there is now. And I think in that moment, that's where that level of appreciation comes into play. So I think if it was the day-to-day, I don't think I would have the time. But in the last moment, or the last moments where hope wouldn't be as great, where the possibility of future truly wouldn't exist as it did before, that's where I think some of these other things would probably be created. That's where I think appreciation would probably be, I wouldn't say the greatest, because that's hard to define, or hard to measure at least. But I think there would be some level of appreciation for sure. How would it look for you?
I would wonder, almost certainly. Although my first instinct is to say I would be so focused on survival.
Yeah.
Inevitably, there would be, I suspect, moments where I wasn't, like as I was going to sleep, or maybe when I was waking up, or after I had scrounged for food and finally found a little bit and found maybe a shed to chill out in. Or maybe if it was really hot that day and right, like I just couldn't walk around that much, or it was winter and there was really nowhere to go. Yeah. Then my mind probably would, in stillness, wonder whatever happened. I think that if I were to live through an apocalypse, let's say, and end up wandering and across some plain in Texas as I was looking for water and heading south or whatever, I somehow ran into you.
Yeah.
I think that would be an indescribably emotional moment, especially if there were very, very few survivors. It would seem so improbable. There's a book I read by an author named Amy Tan that talks about a situation during World War. I don't remember actually when it was. It was in China. And essentially whatever the cataclysms of these wars were, they were such that anyone that could evacuate the cities did.
Right.
And there was, but in the lead up to this war, the heroine of the book would go to the, to get mail. And there was a central like post office where they would pick up the mail. They didn't have a centralized postal service like we do in the United States whenever this was. And so she saw the same clerk there every day who would give her her mail. And this clerk's name was Betty. And there was this apocalyptic situation where the heroine had to leave with her family and flee the city along with everyone else who could. And long time passed. No one really recovered. The city really wasn't the same. She eventually ended up settling in some sort of refugee camp or something. And there was a moment where randomly, of all of the people that she had known, this male clerk, Betty, was there and that survived.
Yeah.
And there was this really poignant moment in the book of them crying and holding each other. And I get a little bit sappy remembering that, because it was so vividly realized.
Mm-hmm.
But it also pointed out to me that sometimes these relationships that appear to be very, very superficial actually still do mean something to us.
Mm-hmm.
And so it might be someone random that I wonder about whatever happened to. There's a UPS man who is the guy who always comes to this particular building.
Mm-hmm.
And every now and then I see him on the street and I say hi, but I will never forget after the first days of COVID and I saw him, I was so glad. I was so glad he was okay. I was so glad he was able to make deliveries there. And he seemed genuinely glad to see me too. Have we said anything other than, thank you for the UPS package, would you please sign this thing?
Yeah.
No. But that was still, I realized, a tie, a connection with another person. And so I wonder if in those moments in the apocalypse, I'd be sitting there under that tree or in that shed thinking, I wonder whatever happened to that UPS guy. I hope he made it out okay. Or I wonder what happened to Oleg. Something tells me Oleg is having a conversation in a refugee camp in Mexico somewhere with a bunch of other straggling survivors.
Yeah.
And that's the only reason that they're alive,
Why is it moments like that? Why is it I've been curious about this. Why is it moments like that where something is not truly appreciated until it's gone or until it's possibly lost? What's your interpretation of that?
I wish I understood the impetus for us taking things for granted.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's that an intense emotion of any sort just simply isn't sustainable, or the body or the mind couldn't handle it. And so it automatically de-emotionalizes it or disconnects it from a strong feeling state so that the mind is able to come down from the emotional high or come up from the emotional low. And is also able to take in new information and not become paralyzed by that emotional state. That's the best I would guess. But then when that moment of reconnection occurs, I was shocked at how emotional I was when I saw him. I really was.
Yeah.
Have you ever had anything like that happen to you?
Yeah, I've had things like that happen many times. And that's where I think my curiosity peaked as far as trying to understand, why does it happen like that? Yeah. Why is it that until that moment, why do I not appreciate things until they're gone? Why do I not appreciate the significance of them until they're no longer there?
Well, one related thing goes as to the platform that we're on right now. First of all, I just saw it belatedly, Gabe saying, love it, guys. And Gabe, I do want to acknowledge that sort of explicit compliment. It's always appreciated when it comes in, and we love that you're here. Let me say that LinkedIn and Facebook, but especially LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Because LinkedIn has exploded to such an extent as a networking place in certain groups of people, particularly various creative or business communities.
Right.
And there are people that we develop relationships with that are meaningful, but at the same time, we are not on top of them all the time. We know them, for instance, because they post in our feed, or we know enough people that know them that eventually we decided to follow them or they followed us. And so I know that Tracy, for instance, is just randomly pull out a name, is an expert in branding. And I look forward to her branding posts. And I know that she's consistent with that. And then Dorothy is a poet. And I know that if I go onto LinkedIn on any given day, there will be some short form of poetry that she'll have put together. And Melody is a writer. And Melody, I know, will always be here for our shows and have something meaningful to say that we really appreciate, as well as Kenny and other people and Gabe. And then they could disappear.
Yeah.
And we might not know right away. We might not even notice because the algorithms don't always push things in our direction, or people are on vacations and they have other things to do in their life, and we have other things going on in our life. And then all of a sudden, a year from now, I'm saying, well, wait a minute, whatever happened to blah, blah, blah? And then you hunt down enough and you might find that, maybe they passed away, or maybe they had an illness. Facebook, that's less of a problem in my experience, because people seem to have the ability to get on Facebook and make an announcement that someone has passed away. I haven't seen that yet on LinkedIn.
On LinkedIn, neither have I.
And so that's one of those things where I could see myself all of a sudden realizing I haven't heard anything from so-and-so who entered into 2021's 365-day challenge on LinkedIn, which I didn't do, thank God. And are they okay?
Yeah. As we wrap up, I just wanted to say that if we were to get into an apocalyptic environment, and I hope that we don't, that we at least give a chance for other people to to be a part of what we created. And I figured the best way to do that is to show the most recent shirts that Spectrum Designs has helped us put together.
Well, I was going to say, if
anything, that could be a great marker,
Exactly.
Like, now I'll know, okay, this person's part of my tribe. This one's part of my tribe. This one's just another squirrel.
Exactly. And let's be honest, that's why I was asking earlier if you would want to look good during the apocalypse. Because if you wear these shirts, you're going to be pretty damn foxy, and there might not be a lot else to look at in the world. So you might as well have a shirt that you're wearing that looks hot. Show us that ad, Oleg. If anyone watching this is interested in a t-shirt, DM me and we can find a way to get one to you, and we would be happy to do so. Spectrum Designs is a t-shirt, a printing company, as well as an embroiderer for apparel that does amazing work. Not only is the quality excellent, which is at the end of the day why we wanted to have them as our sponsor, and we're so excited when they agreed to do so, but they employ a huge number of people. In fact, the overwhelming majority of the staff members that they have are in this situation are folks who are on the autistic spectrum. There is an over 90% unemployment rate within the autism community. Spectrum is out there doing something about it, so they are well worth your patronage. If your company or your special event needs a t-shirt printed, please go to Spectrum Designs. They are worth it. Now, if you want to hear amazing conversations that are twisting and mind-blowing and in-depth and transformative and can completely shift perspectives while you listen to them, there's only really one place to go. Oleg, where might that be? And it certainly ain't my podcast. Oh, well, maybe mine is, but mine's different. Talk to us a little bit about yours.
The podcast that you briefly mentioned is called Overcoming Odds, which is a space for people to share their own personal adversities and obstacles that they face in their lives. And ultimately, I think create a space for others to understand that there is hope at the end of the tunnel, that there's another way to look at the story, which leads into this other podcast series called The Power of the Story. Two are very much interconnected. I think both focus on that personal narrative or the story that one chooses to live. And those are the two places that I would say one can go to prior to an apocalypse, as well as maybe even after an apocalypse. Maybe even during the apocalypse as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, if there's an apocalyptic scenario, you probably need both of them more than ever.
And I know you do a similar thing through your own show, Purpose Highway. So what would the purpose look like after an apocalypse?
We would definitely be interested in exploring that with people, and some of the upcoming episodes that we have may begin to delve into what that might look like, interestingly enough. We just had our season 2 debut released yesterday. I will begin to market that on social media for those of you who follow. I will simply say I'm excited to report that the individuals who were interviewed for it authored a book that was at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 47 weeks. The theme of the show is building community, or building a movement of people who are seeking meaning in a world where the historical institutions for finding meaning are fading away.
Yeah.
Melody said,
it's actually, I think he was the one that you had on the podcast, right?
Who?
Proof of Heaven.
Yes.
I read that book. That was a really interesting book.
Yeah. He's phenomenal, and he has a lot to say, not only about brain consciousness and appreciation, but about the very future of humanity itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Go ahead, Scott.
If anyone enjoyed tonight, and we hope you did, please leave us a review on Facebook and LinkedIn. We really would love to hear from you. We appreciate the feedback, and it helps spread the word about what we're doing. We're committed to it. We love this show, and we love the audience that we have. We appreciate every single bit of participation that's involved here. And without further ado, Oleg, do you have anything to say before we close out?
I just want to appreciate everyone that's been a part of it, because I think that's why these conversations truly turn out the way that they are, is because of the other perspectives and insights that are being shared on a weekly basis, and people like Melody and Gabe and Kenny and Jessica and so many others that choose to show up. I do believe it's a choice that they make in their own lives, because they don't have to be doing those things, but yet they choose to be with us. Yeah. That to me is something that I'm not going to take for granted, and just wanted to acknowledge the fact that they're able to come and help me expand my own perspectives. Exactly. Help me understand, what would I do if an apocalypse were to happen? Exactly. What would it look like? Is it possible that there's one now? Is it not? So I think there's just so many great questions that come up through these conversations, and that's what makes me feel alive at the end of the day, is being able to create a space where I can think.
And make no mistake, we've got plenty of more questions to be asking in the future, apocalypse or not.